July 1942, Nazi tanks are racing to the Nile Delta, keystone of the Allied defense system in Mid-East. Rommel's hordes press irresistibly forward, forcing men and armor back into the narrow bottleneck between the Qattara Depression and the sea. A strip of desert terrain destined to be the hinge on which the Allied fortunes turned, El Alamein. Not a step back. That was the order, and the 8th Army dug its slit trenches and waited. While weary men made this last defense line, the Axis dive bombers pounded the only rail track that served the huge desert army. Not only was Egypt threatened from the west, from the north came the long and menacing shadows of Hitler's armor milling towards the Caspian. The invasion of the historic Levant would close the giant pincers on Egypt. From Haifa to Beirut runs a rocky coastline, and here South African railwaymen raced against time to link these two vital points with a strategic railway, to carry the guns, the armor, the men and the supplies to meet the challenge from the north. The 8th Army was now building up its strength, and in the great ports of Egypt there was all the urgency of war, as South African docks operating companies unloaded the vast supplies from the United Nations industrial resources that were soon to be flung into battle against the formidable Africa Corps. And to meet the transport needs of 500,000 men, there sprung into being a desert assembly line, manned by South Africans of the Railways and Harbours Brigade. From the factories of Britain and the United States came thousands of crates, with scout cars, troop carriers and ambulances, petrol trailers and jeeps. Speed was essential. And from these improvised production lines, 75,000 vehicles rolled forward to the battle areas, bringing up the huge reserves of men and material that Montgomery needed, for the day was at hand. And as the barrage lifted, forward on the heels of the infantry went the men of the Railway Construction Group to relay the mangled desert railway that was to carry the ammunition, the fuel, and the water for the 8th Army's mighty push westward. In the face of desert storm and enemy minefields, these railway springboks drove their steel highway over the desert from Alamein to Tobruk in 28 days. But tracks need trucks, and in a small desert patch near Suez, men of the Railway Operating Company built 1,300 wagons for the Western Desert Railway. And the men who built them were station masters and firemen, signalmen and shunters, sending them on their way to the front, piled high with supplies. The tanks moved on, always menaced by armor-piercing shell and landmines, and the casualties in armor mounted as Axis resistance hardened. Stricken dreadnoughts of the desert, with gaping wounds and torn tracks, lay derelict after the fury of the attack had passed, but not for long. The tank recovery boys, these stretcher bearers for the armor, saw them on their way from the battlefield to the base. Back into a tank workshop that had once been a vast cotton store came the streams of Shermans, Crusaders and Churchills. Here their shattered tracks were removed, their turrets were lifted, and their huge engines overhauled. This was surgery in steel. Hundreds of tanks were refitted and re-examined. No detail too small for these men of the railway brigade who manned the workbenches. Every item that goes to make the tank the formidable fighting weapon it is was made battle-worthy. And then out onto the testing ground. No room for error here. These tests tell the story as nothing else can, that the armor of the Allies was in good hands. And off they went, back into battle, whose frenzy had now swept through Cyrenaica and Tripoli, up into the salt marshes and the wadis of Tunisia. Here was the end. A 1,000-mile platform had been cleared for the assault on Europe. Teamwork was the answer. Rifleman and rail worker, machine gunner and mechanic, they had pulled together. And from this huge platform, the bombers roared over southern Italy. Their targets, the railways, marshalling yards, junctions and bridges, the arteries of transportation. And as the bullfighters tore into the packed railway yards, and as one ammunition train after another splintered to the roar of its own explosives, the men of the railway brigade knew that their biggest job of the war was awaiting them. For the havoc that was spread through the rail system of Italy had to be made good before the massive tide of Allied men and machines could move northward. And when roads are lost in seas of mud, as they were in the winter of '43, the railways carried the burden. They brought up the mammoth tanks and the guns and the supplies for the Allied fighting men. Fresh from their triumphs in North Africa, the railway construction engineers built the vital East Coast Railway in driving rain and bitter cold across the famed Sangro River, up to the enemy-held heights of Pescara. And always the emphasis was on supply, cargoes of war, this time for two great armies, the British 8th and the American 5th. Petrol for tanks, ammunition for aircraft, rockets and landmines, clothing and food, all the amazing paraphernalia of total war. And the docks operating companies, schooled the hard way in the ports of North Africa, handled them with professional ease. Chain of supply links the front line with the ports. Failure anywhere would mean disaster. But these men from the harbors of South Africa well knew the importance of their work. In the supply ports of southern Italy, they cleared the rubble-choked harbors in fantastic surroundings. Scuttled ships, wrecked wharves and shell-scarred buildings. Divers were part of this expert team that opened the way for the vast armada of Allied supply ships. Landmines were lifted and dumped at sea. Back near Rome, another railway unit was at work in the captured Breda Arms factory. Here, to the clang of metal and the splutter of oxyacetylene flame, tanks were repaired, altered and modified to meet the new conditions of war in fascist Europe. Precision equipment too, radio sets and rangefinders, and the armored vehicles left this factory in a steady stream, equipped to the last detail, to swell the northward surge of two great armies. Up near Florence, a railway operating company handled armor that was soon to shatter Kesselring's crack divisions in the north, and one of their proudest consignments was the tanks of the 6th Armored Division. Across the roof of Italy lay the Gothic Line, the last great defense system screening the war factories of Lombardy and the vital land routes to Hitler's crumbling Third Reich. Through this mountain backbone, the Prato-Bologna Railway burrowed on its way northward. This rail link with Central Europe received special attention from the Allied air forces. And as the enemy retreated, bridges were blown, tunnels were blocked, and rails were ruptured. Destruction was never more complete. The task of rebuilding was of staggering proportions. Whole mountainsides had been blasted to close the famed Apennine Tunnel, 11.5 miles long. Hundreds of thousands of tons of rubble were bulldozed and flung out of the way, and the men of the Mines Engineering Brigade, who had learned their tunneling in the quartz-hard bowels of the Witwatersrand, worked side by side with men of the railway construction engineers. Tangled wreckage marked the sites of 21 massive bridges, but soon giant structures of steel were riveted and hammered into place to carry the railway so urgently needed by the Allied army. Before work could be started on the Apennine Tunnel, a colossal cage of steel had to be built to press back the crumbling mountainside. Then rivers of cement were poured into place to shape the giant concrete cylinder which drove deep into the mountains. This tunnel was the greatest engineering feat in the Italian theater of war, and it called for a rare combination of brain and brawn and sweat. But the men of the South African engineers came through this supreme test with flying colors. They fought against time, against snow, floodwaters, and saturating rain. 7 months of desperate toil and the tunnel was restored to working order, a tunnel that took the Italian government 10 years to build. And to the site of this epic of engineering came General Mark Clark of the United States Fifth Army to inspect the great subterranean pipeline through which the flood of supplies for the final assault was to pass. Throughout the winter of 1944, the railway construction engineers hoisted hundreds of steel girders across deep ravines and anchored them into position while the Allied armies pounded the Gothic Line. Men of the Railway Telegraph Company ran out a heavy web of copper to carry power for the supply trains, and the mesh of their signal system linked the Adriatic with the Mediterranean and the South African Armored Division with Rome. As the weather improved, the tempo of work was redoubled, and bridges that had been wrecked when the first flurries of snow fell were carrying trainloads of supplies when spring came. The great Apennine Tunnel was opened, but the wrecked Vado Viaduct immediately beyond barred the way to Bologna. Torn out by its roots, only stumps of masonry remained where once stood an 1,100-foot curved railway bridge. But massive piers soon grew out of the riverbed. Prefabricated girders were linked together and bound by a ribbon of steel rails. Back from the historic San Francisco conference came Field Marshal Smuts to see the work of his railway springboks. The war was crashing to a close. the enemy realized that defeat was inevitable, and one of the reasons was this railway, this spear of steel, pointed at the heart of the last bastion of the Nazis in Italy. These men of the South African railways were a vigorous vanguard. Their bridges, their tunnels, and their viaducts are more than steel and concrete. They are lasting monuments to the ideals of men who had seen years of war service. From the ports of Somaliland to the Awash River Bridge, from the Nile Delta to the coastal plains of Libya and Tunis, 14,000 railwaymen had worn the orange flash. Men whose single purpose was to serve South Africa in war and in peace and in the future.